You know, after more than 40 years sitting on this bench, I've learned that the smallest cases often carry the heaviest lessons. I've seen people walk into my courtroom wearing fear like a coat they can't take off. But one morning, an 87-year-old grandfather stood before me, living only on Social Security, clutching a parking ticket he simply couldn't afford to pay. What he said next stopped me cold, and when I finally looked at him and made my decision, I knew I was doing exactly what justice was meant to do. Let me tell you what happened that day, because this is a story about dignity, survival, and why sometimes the law has to make room for humanity. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a judge in Providence for over 40 years. Every morning I follow the same routine. I wake up early, usually before the sun, and I move quietly so I don't wake my wife. After decades together, she knows my habits better than I do. I make my coffee strong and black, no sugar, no cream. I've had it the same way for as long as I can remember. My father came to this country from Italy with nothing but a suitcase and hope. He worked hard his entire life. He taught me that respect is earned through how you treat people, especially when they have nothing to give you back. That lesson has guided every decision I've made on this bench. That particular morning felt ordinary at first. I arrived at the courthouse at 8:15, just like always. Christina, my clerk, greeted me with a smile and handed me my coffee. She knows exactly how I like it. I could smell it before I even took the lid off. I sat down at my desk and began reviewing the case files for the day. Parking tickets, expired registrations, minor violations, the kinds of cases people think don't matter. But I've learned that every file represents a human being, and every human being has a story. When court began, the first few cases moved quickly. People explained themselves. Some were nervous, some were frustrated, some were embarrassed. I listened to all of them. I always do. Then Christina called the next case. I looked up and read the name. As I said it out loud, I watched a man slowly stand up from the gallery. He moved carefully, deliberately, like each step required thought. He held onto the back of the bench in front of him for balance. That caught my attention immediately. I watched him make his way toward the podium. He was tall once, I could tell, but age had bent him forward slightly. His hair was thin and white. He wore a simple jacket that looked older than most of the people in the room. When he reached the podium, he didn't rush. He placed both hands on the edge and took a breath. I asked him how he was doing. He smiled politely and said, "I'm doing the best I can, Your Honor." There was no complaint in his voice, just honesty. I asked him what brought him into my courtroom. He told me he had received a parking ticket. He said it softly, almost apologetically, like he was embarrassed to be there. I asked him why the ticket hadn't been paid. He looked down for a moment. Then he looked back up at me. His eyes were clear, tired but clear. He said, "Your Honor, I live on Social Security. I just couldn't afford it." That sentence hit me harder than he probably realized. I asked him how old he was. He said, 87. The room grew quiet, not because anyone told it to, because everyone was listening. I asked him if he was still working. He shook his head slowly and said, "No, sir, those days are behind me." I asked him if he lived alone. He nodded and said his wife had passed away several years earlier. He said it calmly, but I could hear the weight behind the words. I asked him what his monthly income was. He told me the amount, Social Security, fixed, no extras. As he spoke, I watched his hands. They were steady, not shaking. That told me something. This wasn't panic, this was acceptance, the kind that comes after a lifetime of doing things the right way. I asked him how much the ticket was. When I heard the amount, I felt my chest tighten. To some people, it's nothing. To him, it was groceries, medication, heat. I asked him what happened the day he got the ticket. He explained that he parked near the pharmacy. He said his legs weren't what they used to be. He said he thought he was allowed to park there for a short time. He said he made a mistake. He didn't argue. He didn't deny responsibility. He said, "I know I was wrong. I just couldn't pay it." I leaned forward slightly. I wanted him to know I was listening. I asked him if he had ever been in trouble before. He shook his head. He said, "Never. First time in my life I've been in court." That stayed with me. I thought about 87 years of living, 87 years of following rules, 87 years of contributing to society. And now he stood before me because he couldn't afford a parking ticket. I had to pause. I removed my glasses and held them in my hand. I took a breath. I thought about my father. I thought about aging. I thought about what it means to live on a fixed income while the world keeps getting more expensive. I asked him something important. I said, "Sir, if you pay this ticket, what do you go without?" He didn't hesitate. He said, "My medication." That answer settled everything for me. I looked at him and said, "You're not paying today." His eyes widened slightly. He didn't speak at first. I said it again gently, "You're not paying today." He swallowed hard. I could see tears forming, but he tried to fight them. I said, "You've lived your life the right way. You don't deserve to choose between medicine and a parking ticket." The courtroom felt different in that moment. You could feel it. He said, "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you so much." I raised my hand and said, "That's enough. Take care of yourself." As he walked away from the podium, he moved a little lighter. Not faster, just lighter. Now let me pause here for just a second. I want to ask you something. Have you ever known someone who worked their whole life and still struggled just to get by? Someone who did everything right and still had to make impossible choices? Leave me a comment and tell me about it. And if this story is touching you, hit that like button for me. Court continued, but I couldn't stop thinking about him, about how many people like him exist, quiet, proud, invisible. And I had a feeling the day wasn't done teaching lessons yet. After the elderly gentleman stepped away from the podium, I sat there for a moment longer than usual. I didn't rush to the next case. I didn't look down at the file right away. I just watched him carefully as he made his way back to the gallery. He walked slowly, the same way he had walked up, but something was different now. His shoulders weren't as tense. His head wasn't as low. He wasn't smiling, but there was relief in his face. The kind of relief that comes when a heavy worry is finally lifted. I've seen that look many times over the years, and every time it reminds me why discretion exists in the law. Christina called the next case, and court moved on like it always does. Names, charges, explanations, apologies. But my mind kept drifting back to that 87-year-old man, to the way he said he lived on Social Security, to the way he answered my question about medication without hesitation. That answer told me everything I needed to know about his priorities. As the morning went on, I noticed something else. People in the gallery were quieter than usual, more attentive. It happens sometimes after a moment like that, when everyone in the room is reminded that the law isn't just about rules. It's about people. About 30 minutes later, Christina called another case involving a parking violation. I looked down at the file and then back up at the person approaching the podium. It was a younger man this time, confident, restless. He spoke quickly and explained why he thought the ticket wasn't fair. He wanted to argue the sign, the timing, the enforcement. I listened patiently. I always do. But as he spoke, I found myself thinking about the difference between inconvenience and hardship, between frustration and survival. When he finished, I ruled according to the law, fairly, firmly, without drama. That's the balance people don't always see. Compassion doesn't mean ignoring responsibility. It means understanding context. As court continued, I noticed the elderly gentleman still sitting in the gallery. He hadn't left yet. That caught my attention. Most people leave as soon as their case is called. He stayed. During a short recess, I watched him stand up carefully and walk toward the back of the room. He stopped near Christina's desk and said something to her quietly. She nodded and smiled. When I returned to the bench, Christina leaned toward me and whispered, "He just wanted to say thank you again." He said he's never been treated so kindly in a courtroom before. I felt something tighten in my chest when she said that. Not pride, responsibility. I nodded and said, "Thank him for me." Court resumed, but I couldn't shake the thought that his case was a reflection of a much larger problem, one that doesn't always make headlines. Seniors living on fixed incomes, people who work their entire lives and now live carefully, counting every dollar. I thought about my own parents, about how my mother stretched every penny, about how proud my father was, even when money was tight. He hated asking for help. Many people from his generation do. That's why cases like this matter, because people like that gentleman don't come into court looking for favors. They come in because they have no other choice. Later that morning, Christina called a case that brought that contrast into even sharper focus. A middle-aged man walked up to the podium, well-dressed, confident. He explained that he hadn't paid his ticket because he forgot. He said it casually, like forgetting was a valid excuse. I asked him if paying the ticket would cause him any hardship. He laughed and said, "No, not really." I nodded and said, "Then you'll pay it today." He looked surprised, not angry, just surprised, like he expected the outcome to be the same for everyone regardless of circumstances. That's when I said something I want you to hear clearly. I said, "The law treats everyone equally, but justice requires understanding differences." He paid the fine without another word. I thought again about the elderly gentleman, about how equality doesn't mean identical outcomes, it means fair ones. At lunchtime, I returned to my chambers and sat quietly with my coffee. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't check my phone. I just sat there and reflected. I thought about aging, about how time humbles everyone eventually, about how quickly independence can slip away. I wondered how many people like him were sitting at home right now, staring at bills, deciding what they could afford to skip. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. As I was reviewing files, Christina knocked on my door and said, "Judge, that gentleman from earlier is still here. He's asking if he can speak to you." I was surprised. I asked her what it was about. She said he didn't say. He just asked politely. I told her to bring him in. When he stepped into my chambers, he looked nervous, like he didn't want to be a bother. He stood near the door instead of sitting down. I asked him to have a seat. He sat slowly and folded his hands in his lap. He said, "I just wanted to tell you something, Your Honor." I told him to go ahead. He said, "I've been worried about that ticket for weeks. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about it. Today, you gave me peace." That word stayed with me. Peace. He said, "I worked for 45 years. I never asked for anything. Today was the first time I felt like someone saw me. I had to look down for a moment. I removed my glasses and rubbed my eyes. I told him, 'Sir, you earned that respect long before today.'" He nodded, thanked me again, and stood carefully. Before he left, he said something else. He said, "I hope you know how much this means to people like me." I watched him leave my chamber slowly, thoughtfully, and when the door closed, I sat there quietly. That conversation stayed with me more than the ruling itself. Now let me pause here for a moment and ask you something. Have you ever felt invisible? Like the world moved faster than you could keep up? Like no one saw how hard you were trying? If you have, leave me a comment and tell me. And if this story is resonating with you, hit that like button for me. Court resumed that afternoon, but the tone of the day had already been set. And I had a feeling there was still more this day was going to teach me. After that elderly gentleman left my chambers, I sat there quietly for a long time. I didn't reach for the next file. I didn't call Christina back in right away. I just sat with what he said. When someone tells you that you gave them peace, that's not something you brush aside. I've learned over the years that peace is one of the rarest things people come looking for in a courtroom. Most come with anger, fear, defensiveness. But that man came carrying worry that had been weighing on him for weeks, and all he needed was to be seen. That realization followed me back into the courtroom. When I returned to the bench, I noticed something else. The gallery felt different. People weren't whispering. They weren't shifting around in their seats. They were paying attention, not just to their own cases, but to what justice looked like when it was applied with care. Christina called the next case, and I looked up to see a woman about my age walk to the podium. She seemed nervous. She clutched her papers tightly. I asked her what brought her in, and she explained her situation honestly. I ruled fairly, according to the law, but I made sure she understood the process. As she walked away, she looked back at me and nodded. That small gesture mattered. Between cases, my mind kept returning to that grandfather, 87 years old, living on Social Security, still apologizing for a mistake, still taking responsibility. I thought about how many people his age refuse to complain even when they're struggling. They were raised to endure, to push through, to not ask for help. Sometimes the hardest thing for people like that isn't paying a fine, it's admitting they can't. That afternoon, Christina called another case that added another layer to the day. A man in his 40s approached the podium. He looked irritated before he even spoke. He explained his ticket quickly, dismissively, and said he shouldn't have to pay it because enforcement was unfair. I listened carefully. When he finished, I asked him one simple question. I said, "Sir, is paying this ticket going to cause you hardship?" He shrugged and said, "No, it's just annoying," that word again, annoying. I nodded and said, "Then you'll pay it." He looked surprised. He opened his mouth to speak again, but I raised my hand gently. I said, "The law doesn't bend for annoyance, it bends for hardship." He paid the fine and walked away quietly. I didn't say that to embarrass him. I said it to make a point. Justice isn't about convenience, it's about fairness. After that case, I noticed something else. The elderly gentleman was no longer in the gallery. He had gone home. And somehow, knowing that brought me comfort. I imagined him sitting at his kitchen table, maybe having a cup of coffee, maybe breathing easier for the first time in weeks. That image stayed with me. During a short recess, Christina leaned over and said, "Judge, I just wanted to tell you something." I asked her what it was. She said, "My grandfather lived on Social Security too. He used to worry the same way. Today reminded me of him." I nodded. Sometimes the people who work closest to the law understand its impact the most. As the day went on, I found myself thinking about aging in general, about how independence slowly slips away, about how the world doesn't slow down just because your body does. I've seen seniors come into my courtroom ashamed because they couldn't keep up with rising costs, ashamed because they needed help, ashamed because they made a mistake they never would have made years earlier. That shame doesn't belong to them. It belongs to a system that often forgets them. Later that afternoon, something unexpected happened. A young man stood up from the gallery and asked if he could speak. That's unusual. I asked him to identify himself. He said he was the elderly gentleman's grandson. That caught my attention immediately. I asked him to come forward. He looked nervous but respectful. He said he had driven his grandfather to court that morning, but had to leave for work before his case was called. He came back later to pick him up. He said his grandfather told him what happened. Then he said something that stayed with me. He said, "My grandfather hasn't stopped talking about you. He said you reminded him that kindness still exists." I felt my chest tighten, not with pride, with humility. I told him to pass along my best wishes. The grandson nodded and thanked me. He said, "You don't know how much today meant to him." I watched him walk away, and I thought about generations, about how one moment in a courtroom can travel far beyond its walls. That's something people don't see. They see a ruling. They don't see the ripples. That evening, when I went home, my wife noticed something different about me. She always does. She asked, "Busy day?" I said, "Meaningful day." I told her about the grandfather, about the conversation in my chambers, about the word peace. She listened quietly. Then she said, "Your father would have liked him." That hit me harder than she knew. My father valued hard work, humility, and responsibility. That grandfather embodied all of it. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, not because I was troubled, but because I was thinking about how many people live quietly with dignity, how rarely they ask for anything, how much they deserve respect. I also thought about how easily the law can feel cold if we let it, how important it is to remember that statutes don't live lives. People do. The next morning, as I got ready for court, I tied my tie a little slower. I looked at myself in the mirror and reminded myself why I started this journey. I didn't become a judge to punish. I became one to serve justice. Justice isn't blind to circumstance, it considers it. That day with the 87-year-old grandfather reinforced something I've always believed. The law should never push someone further down when life has already done enough. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever known an older person who carried their worries quietly? Someone who never complained but struggled more than anyone knew? Leave me a comment and tell me about them. And if this story is speaking to you, hit that like button for me. There's still more to this story, more reflection, more lessons, and one moment that tied everything together for me in a way I didn't expect. When I returned to court the next morning, I carried that grandfather with me. Not physically, of course, but in the way certain cases stay with you. You don't see them on the docket, but they sit quietly in your mind, reminding you to slow down, to listen, to remember why this work matters. I've always believed that a judge doesn't leave yesterday at the courthouse door. Yesterday comes with you. It shapes how you listen today. As I took my seat on the bench, I scanned the gallery out of habit. Different faces, different worries, different stories waiting to be told. But the feeling in the room was familiar. That quiet anticipation, that hope mixed with fear. Christina handed me my coffee just the way I like it, strong, black. She smiled and said, "Ready?" I nodded and said, "Always." The first few cases that morning were routine, parking violations, missed court dates, people explaining themselves the best they could. I listened carefully the way I always do, but I noticed something interesting. People were calmer, more respectful. Like word had spread, sometimes justice teaches without saying a word. Mid-morning, Christina called a case that immediately caught my attention. Another senior citizen, not as old as the grandfather from the day before, but close, late 70s, I guessed. He walked slowly to the podium using a cane. I watched carefully, the way I always do when someone older approaches. You learn to read movement over the years, to notice when someone is rushing versus when they're simply doing their best. I asked him how he was doing. He said, "Getting by, Your Honor." That phrase again, getting by. I asked him what brought him to court. Another ticket, another small mistake, another worry that felt much bigger than it looked on paper. As he explained his situation, I found myself asking more questions than usual, about his income, about his health, about his support system. I could feel the gallery listening, really listening. I wasn't trying to make a point. I was trying to understand. When I finished hearing his story, I ruled fairly, not dramatically, not harshly, fairly. I explained my reasoning clearly. I made sure he understood. As he walked away, he turned back and said, "Thank you for explaining it to me." That's something people don't realize matters. Explanation is respect. When people understand why something happens, it feels less like punishment and more like order. During a break, I sat back in my chair and thought about how aging changes your relationship with the world. The world doesn't stop, it speeds up. Technology moves faster, rules feel more complicated, costs rise. Patience from others sometimes falls away. For people living on fixed incomes, every decision becomes a calculation. Can I afford this? Can I afford not to? I've seen seniors skip meals to pay bills. I've seen them delay medical care because copays felt impossible. And I've seen them stand in my courtroom ashamed, like they did something wrong by growing old. That breaks my heart. That afternoon, something happened that truly confirmed what that grandfather had started. Christina called a case involving a young woman, maybe in her 20s. She was clearly upset. She explained her ticket quickly, frustration spilling over. She felt targeted. She felt overwhelmed. As she spoke, she kept glancing toward the gallery. I asked her why. She said her grandfather was sitting there. She said he told her to watch how court works. She said he wanted her to see justice for herself. That stopped me. I asked her grandfather to stand. He stood slowly, respectfully. I asked him why he brought her. He said, I wanted her to see that the law isn't something to fear if you tell the truth. I felt my chest tighten. That was it. That was the ripple. I handled her case carefully, firm where needed, understanding where appropriate. When I finished, she nodded and said thank you. As she walked away, she hugged her grandfather. I looked down for a moment. I had to. Moments like that deserve privacy, even in public. I've always believed that courts teach values whether we intend to or not. People watch how authority is used. They learn whether power listens. That day, the lesson was spreading. Later that afternoon, Christina handed me a note. It was from someone in the gallery. Short, simple. It said, "Thank you for reminding us that the law has a heart." I folded it carefully and put it in my pocket. I don't collect praise, but I collect reminders. That note reminded me of something important. People don't expect perfection from judges. They expect fairness. They expect humanity. They expect to be treated like they matter. I think about the 87-year-old grandfather again, about how quietly he lived, how carefully he spoke, how much courage it probably took for him to admit he couldn't pay. That courage deserves respect. I wish more people understood that asking for help is not weakness. It's honesty, and honesty is the foundation of justice. As the day wound down, I found myself tired in a different way, not drained, fulfilled, the kind of tired you feel when your work meant something. When I left the courthouse that evening, I walked a little slower. I looked around more. I watched people passing by, each of them carrying something invisible. I thought about how many people feel unseen, especially as they age, especially when they no longer feel useful. That grandfather felt seen that day, and in return, he reminded an entire room what dignity looks like. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched an older person struggle quietly, refusing to complain? Someone who deserved far more kindness than they ever asked for? Tell me about them in the comments. And if you believe stories like this matter, hit that like button for me. There's still more to tell you, because what happened in the days that followed gave this story an ending I didn't expect. In the days that followed, I kept thinking about that grandfather more than I expected to. I've seen thousands of defendants walk through my courtroom over the years, but every so often, one reminds you why you still show up every morning. He was one of them. I found myself replaying the moment he stood at the podium, the way he held himself, the way he didn't ask for mercy but accepted responsibility. There was dignity in that, and dignity deserves to be met with respect. I've learned something over time. When someone has lived a long life honestly, hardship doesn't make them bitter. It makes them quieter. They don't complain. They don't demand. They just endure. That's what stayed with me. The following week, I saw a noticeable change in how people approached my courtroom. Seniors came in more prepared to speak. Younger people came in more attentive. It was subtle, but it was there. Word spreads quietly in communities like this. Not through headlines, through conversations at dinner tables, through grandparents telling grandchildren, tell the truth, they'll listen. That's powerful. One afternoon, Christina brought me a stack of letters. I don't get many handwritten letters anymore. Most communication happens online now, but these were handwritten, careful, thoughtful. One letter stood out. It was from a woman in her 70s. She wrote that she had watched the grandfather's case online. She said she had been afraid to go to court for months over a small violation because she was embarrassed and scared. She said watching that moment gave her courage. She wrote, "I realized I'm not invisible." That line stayed with me. Invisibility is one of the quietest forms of suffering, especially among the elderly. When you age, the world stops asking what you need. It starts assuming you need less. That couldn't be further from the truth. I thought again about my parents, about how my mother stretched every dollar, about how my father hated feeling like a burden, even when he needed help. That generation carried pride differently. Asking for help felt like failure. That's why the law has to be careful with them, firm when necessary, but gentle when deserved. A few days later, something else happened that brought everything together. Christina told me the grandfather had sent something to the court, not a letter, a card. I opened it slowly. Inside, in careful handwriting, he wrote a short message, just a few lines. He wrote that he had gone to the pharmacy that same week and filled his prescription without fear. He wrote that for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a problem that needed to be fixed. That sentence hit me harder than anything else. I didn't feel like a problem. No one should feel like a problem simply for surviving. I sat there for a long time after reading that card. I thought about how many people feel like burdens, how many seniors feel like they're in the way, how often society measures worth by productivity instead of humanity. That's not justice, that's neglect. I keep cards like that in my drawer, not as trophies, as reminders. They remind me that the smallest decisions often carry the greatest weight. Another day in court, a younger defendant stood before me arguing loudly about a fine. He complained about inconvenience, about wasted time, about unfairness. I listened patiently, but when he finished, I said something I rarely say. I said, I had an 87-year-old man stand right here last week. He worried about choosing between medication and a ticket. Perspective matters. The room went quiet. The young man nodded. He paid the fine without another word. That wasn't about shame. That was about understanding. Justice isn't about comparison, but perspective helps people see beyond themselves. As weeks passed, I noticed myself paying even closer attention to seniors who came before me, asking one extra question, slowing things down, making sure they understood, because confusion can feel like guilt when it shouldn't. One afternoon, a woman in her 80s approached the podium. She was nervous. She apologized before she even spoke. I stopped her gently. I said, "You don't need to apologize for being here. This is what the court is for." She visibly relaxed. That moment mattered. I've learned that reassurance can be just as important as rulings. I also noticed how younger people in the gallery reacted when seniors were treated with patience. They watched. They learned. Respect is taught by example. That's how values survive. People often think justice is loud, gavel strikes, sentences, consequences. But the justice that lasts is quiet. It's in the tone, the listening, the understanding. That grandfather didn't leave my courtroom richer. He left lighter. And sometimes that's everything. I don't know how many years he has left. None of us do. But I know this. He'll remember that day. And his family will too, and that memory will travel with them. That's the legacy of fairness. I've been asked many times why I'm still here after all these years, why I haven't stepped away, why I still put on this robe every morning. This is why. Because every now and then, someone reminds you that justice can still feel human, that the law doesn't have to crush people to function. That dignity matters. That grandfather gave me something that day too. He reminded me that kindness doesn't weaken authority. It strengthens it. There's still one last thing I want to share with you, one final reflection that ties this entire story together. As more time passed, I realized that day had changed me in a way I didn't expect, not in a dramatic headline kind of way, but quietly, subtly, the way the most important lessons always do. After 4 decades on this bench, you'd think there wouldn't be much left to learn. But life has a way of humbling you when you least expect it. I kept thinking about that grandfather, not just what he said, but how he said it, the calm in his voice, the absence of complaint, the way he accepted responsibility without resentment. Those qualities don't come from nowhere. They come from a lifetime of showing up, doing your part, and not asking for more than you deserve. People like him don't see themselves as special. They don't think the rules shouldn't apply to them. They believe the rules apply to everyone, including themselves. And that kind of humility is rare. When you encounter it, it deserves respect. I've learned something important over the years. When someone has lived an honest life, hardship doesn't make them angry. It makes them quiet. They don't lash out. They don't argue. They internalize the burden. And that's exactly what he had been doing for weeks. Losing sleep over a ticket he couldn't afford. That kind of worry wears on a person, especially at his age. I thought about how many seniors live like that every day, quietly worried, carefully calculating, making choices no one should have to make. medication or food, heat or transportation, dignity or survival. Those choices don't make headlines, but they define lives. One afternoon, not long after that case, Christina knocked on my door and asked if she could speak with me for a moment. I could tell by her expression that it wasn't about a file. She said, "Judge, I've been thinking about that gentleman a lot." I asked her why. She told me about her own grandfather, how proud he was, how he hated asking for help, how he would rather go without than feel like a burden. She said watching that case reminded her of him. That meant something to me, because it confirmed what I already knew. Justice doesn't stop at the person standing before you. It reaches the people watching, the clerks, the families, the community. That's how trust is built. In the weeks that followed, I noticed something subtle but meaningful. Seniors came into my courtroom a little less afraid. Still nervous, yes, but not ashamed. They spoke more openly. They asked questions. They trusted that they wouldn't be dismissed. Trust is fragile. Once it's broken, it's hard to repair, but when it's nurtured, it grows. I remember one morning when an elderly woman approached the podium. Her hands shook as she held her paperwork. Before she even explained her case, she apologized. She said, "I'm sorry to bother the court." I stopped her gently. I said, "You're not a bother. This court exists for you." I watched her shoulders relax instantly. That one sentence changed the entire interaction. Her voice steadied. She explained her situation clearly, and when she left, she walked taller than when she arrived. That's the power of reassurance. It costs nothing, but it gives everything. I've seen too many seniors feel like they're in the way, like the world has moved on without them, like they need to apologize for still being here. That breaks my heart every time. The law should never make someone feel disposable. That grandfather never asked me for mercy directly. He never pleaded. He never begged. He simply told the truth, and the truth demanded fairness. People often confuse compassion with weakness. They think that being kind somehow undermines authority. But I've learned the opposite is true. Authority without compassion becomes cruelty. Compassion without authority becomes chaos. The balance is everything. Let me tell you something I've learned after all these years. The law is not fragile. It doesn't shatter when you treat people humanely. It breaks when people stop believing it serves them. That day, belief was restored. I also spent a lot of time thinking about independence, how much it means to people of that generation. Losing independence feels like losing yourself. When someone like that grandfather admits they can't afford something, it's not just financial, it's emotional, it's personal. That moment deserves respect. One evening, as I was leaving the courthouse, a man stopped me in the hallway. He introduced himself as a veteran. He told me he had watched that case earlier in the week. He said, "I just wanted you to know." That meant something to a lot of us. A lot of us. That phrase stayed with me. He wasn't just talking about seniors. He was talking about people who feel unseen, people who gave years of their lives to work, to service, to family, and now feel like the world no longer notices them. Justice tells people whether they still matter. That's not something judges talk about much, but it's true. I've always believed that courts should be places where dignity is preserved whenever possible, where people leave understanding what happened and why. Even if they don't leave happy, they should leave respected. That grandfather left respected, and that mattered more than the ticket itself. As months went by, I occasionally wondered how he was doing. Judges aren't supposed to follow cases emotionally, but we're human. We wonder, we hope. Then one afternoon, Christina told me someone had stopped by the courthouse. It was his grandson. He didn't ask to see me. He didn't want attention. He just wanted to drop something off. It was a photograph. I opened it carefully. The picture showed the grandfather sitting at a small kitchen table. He was smiling. In front of him was a birthday cake with 88 candles. His posture wasn't perfect. His body still showed age, but his face showed peace. On the back of the photo, the grandson had written a short note. He wrote, "Thank you for giving him peace when he needed it." I sat there for a long time holding that photograph. Peace. That word again. That's when it fully hit me. Justice isn't always about correcting behavior. Sometimes it's about protecting humanity, about letting someone finish their life with dignity instead of fear. That grandfather didn't need punishment. He needed understanding, and because he received it, his remaining years felt lighter. That matters. I think about how society measures value, by productivity, by speed, by income. But people like that grandfather remind us that value is built over time, through character, through consistency, through doing the right thing when no one is watching. When I said, "You're not paying today," I wasn't ignoring the law. I was honoring its purpose. The purpose of the law is not to squeeze the last dollar out of someone who has nothing left. It's to maintain order with fairness. That distinction matters more than people realize. I hope when people watch that moment, they didn't just see a ticket dismissed. I hope they saw what justice is supposed to look like. Firm when necessary, gentle when deserved. After 40 years on this bench, I've seen laws change, technology change, society change. But one thing never should: human dignity. That day reminded me why I still believe in this system, even when it's imperfect. Why I still put on this robe every morning. Why I still slow down, listen carefully, and look people in the eye. Because sometimes all someone needs is to be seen. Now let me ask you something personal. Do you believe we take care of our elders the way we should? Do you believe they're listened to enough? I want to know what you think. If this story reminded you of someone you love, someone who worked their whole life and still struggles, hit that like button. It tells me these stories matter. I've spent a lifetime in courtrooms, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the law doesn't just judge actions. It reveals values. It shows you what a society cares about, who it protects, and who it forgets. That day with the 87-year-old grandfather stayed with me because it exposed something we don't like to talk about very often. How easily people who gave everything to this country can become invisible. After all those years on the bench, you'd think I'd be hardened, immune, but I'm not. I never wanted to be. The day I stop feeling something when people stand before me is the day I shouldn't be wearing this robe anymore. That grandfather reminded me of that. I kept thinking about how carefully he chose his words, how he didn't raise his voice, how he didn't demand anything. He didn't try to manipulate me with emotion. He just told the truth, and the truth was enough. I've learned that honesty carries its own authority. You can feel it when someone is being real with you. There's no performance, no exaggeration, just reality standing there quietly. That's what he brought into my courtroom. I also kept thinking about how afraid he must have been before he came in. How many nights he probably lay awake staring at the ceiling, worrying about that ticket, worrying about money, worrying about being a burden, worrying about making a mistake at his age when mistakes feel less forgivable. Fear doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like silence, and I've seen too many seniors live in that silence. People assume that when you reach a certain age, you stop worrying, that you're somehow at peace. But the truth is, worries just change shape. They become quieter but heavier. Fixed incomes, rising costs, health issues, loneliness, the fear of losing independence. Those worries don't go away, they pile up. That's why when he said he couldn't pay the ticket without sacrificing his medication, the decision was already made in my heart. Not because I wanted to be kind, but because justice demanded it. Justice demanded that the law not be used as a weapon against someone who had already paid their dues in life. People sometimes ask me where compassion fits into the law. They think compassion is optional, something you add when you feel generous. They're wrong. Compassion is part of justice. Without it, the law becomes mechanical, cold, detached from the people it's meant to serve. That day, compassion didn't weaken the law. It strengthened it. I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately, not mine, but the legacy we leave through our decisions. Judges don't just leave rulings behind. We leave examples. We teach people, without realizing it, what power should look like. That grandfather learned that the law could see him. His grandson learned that authority could listen. The people in the gallery learned that fairness isn't always loud. Those lessons matter. I often think about my father when I reflect on cases like this. He worked hard his entire life. He never complained. He believed deeply in fairness, not favoritism. Fairness. He used to say, "Frank, if you do your job right, people won't always like the outcome, but they'll respect the process." That's what I try to honor every day. I know there are people watching these stories who feel forgotten, seniors who worked for decades and now struggle quietly, veterans, widows, grandparents raising grandchildren, people who did everything right and still ended up living carefully. I want you to hear this clearly. You matter. You matter to this system. You matter to this country. And you deserve dignity, not shame. That grandfather walked into my courtroom thinking he had failed. He walked out knowing he was still valued. That difference changes how someone carries themselves in the world. And that's not something a fine can measure. I also want to talk honestly about responsibility, because mercy doesn't mean ignoring rules. It means understanding context. That grandfather accepted responsibility. He didn't deny his mistake. He didn't argue the ticket. He acknowledged it. That's why mercy was appropriate. If he had laughed, if he had dismissed the law, if he had shown entitlement, the outcome would have been different. Character matters. Always has. Always will. Justice isn't blind to behavior. It responds to it. I hope people watching understand that. This isn't about age alone. It's about honesty, humility, and effort. I've seen wealthy people receive no mercy because they showed none. And I've seen people with nothing receive understanding because they deserved it. Equality under the law doesn't mean identical treatment. It means fair treatment. That distinction is critical. As more time passed, I noticed something else. Younger people started mentioning seniors in their explanations. They started talking about parents, grandparents, responsibilities. It was like a door had opened, a reminder that we're all connected. Justice doesn't exist in isolation. It reflects the values of the people who believe in it. That's why I still believe in storytelling. Not because it entertains, but because it teaches. Because stories stay with us longer than rules. You may forget the amount of that ticket, but you won't forget the image of an 87-year-old man standing quietly, worried about medication, doing his best. That image stays, and maybe the next time someone sees an elderly person struggling, they'll be more patient, kinder, more willing to listen. That's how change happens, slowly, person by person. I also want to address something else honestly. Some people will say I was too lenient, that I set a precedent, that rules are rules. I understand that perspective. I respect it. But let me tell you something I've learned in 4 decades. A system that cannot show mercy when mercy is deserved is not strong. It's brittle. Strong systems bend without breaking. That day, the law bent toward fairness, and it held. I don't regret that decision for a second. If I had the same case tomorrow, I would make the same ruling, because justice isn't about numbers, it's about people. I think again about that photograph, the grandfather smiling in front of his birthday cake, 88 candles, a full life, a quiet smile. That picture sits in my memory now alongside thousands of cases, and yet it stands out because it represents something rare, peace. Peace is something courts don't often give, but that day it did. And that's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my time on this bench. So let me ask you this. Do you think we show enough compassion to our elders? Do you think we listen to them the way we should? Or have we become too busy, too rushed, too focused on convenience to notice? I genuinely want to know what you think. And here's another question. If you were in my position, standing where I stood that day, what would you have done? Would you have made the same decision? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone you love, someone who worked their whole life and still struggles, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, someone who believes that dignity matters, someone who believes character matters more than money. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. I'll see you tomorrow with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for more than 40 years because I believe something simple. We are all equal before the law, every single one of us, rich or poor, young or old, powerful or powerless. That's what makes this country work. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you, and remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything.